Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, June 20th, 2025, and our friends Trita, Parsi, Ambassador Chas Freeman, and Colonel Wilkerson are back with us. Welcome back.
Good to be with
Glad to
you.
be here.
Good. Thank you.
Trita, let's start with you. And you were so much optimistic last time we talked about the Trump administration and the way they were trying to negotiate to talk with Iranians. Right now, they gave the green light to Netanyahu and his administration to attack Iran, something that the Netanyahu administration couldn't achieve during the Biden administration. Your take on what's going on?
Thank you. It's good to be with you again. And yes, the situation has changed dramatically, obviously, since then. I think what happened, the reason why we're in this situation is that Trump managed to get to the table, manage to create a decent atmosphere for negotiations because his red line was only weaponization. As long as that was the case, there was a pathway to a deal. And frankly, a better deal than what Obama managed to get because of a variety of factors that I think we talked about last time. Halfway through the negotiations, Trump somehow was convinced by the Israelis to shift his red line to the Israeli red line, zero enrichment and dismantlement of the program. And that's where we see the trajectory of the situation change dramatically because it predictably led to a stalemate, which the Israelis exactly knew would happen. They wanted this. Once the stalemate occurred, they went to Trump and said, let us go in militarily. You're not needed, but if we can bomb them, they will come back and they'll beg you for surrender and they'll agree to zero enrichment, knowing very well, of course, that that's not what would happen. And it didn't happen. So within 48 hours, they were back at the White House and said, well, you know what? Actually, why don't you come in and bomb Iran, which was the plan from the outset. The original sin is that Trump shifted from his own red line, which had actually paved the way for diplomacy, to the Israeli red line, which paves the way for war. And that's why we are where we are.
Yeah. Ambassador.
Well, I agree with all of that. I think the fundamental problem has not changed. Israel essentially wants not just the removal of nuclear capacity from Iran, but the disarmament of Iran and the subjugation of Iran, just as it has dealt with Syria. And the same rhetoric we're hearing. Iran is, of course, a multi-ethnic country. Something between 50 and 60% of Iranians are Persian. But as Nima can attest, there are many other groups in the country, and some of them are restive. And so we see that Netanyahu is reported to have promised Baku, that is the country of Azerbaijan, that it can take over Iranian Azerbaijan. That is, the ex-Soviet Azerbaijan will absorb the Iranian Persian Azerbaijan. And Azeris are, what, I don't know, 7 million or so inside Iran. Quite a substantial group of people. We don't know what's been promised to the Kurds in this connection. There's clearly an effort to pulverize Iran, fragment it, and thereby reduce it as a potential power in the region to the benefit of Israeli hegemony. So I think you're absolutely right, Trita. We started out with an America First policy. It shifted to an Israel First policy, and Israel is essentially implacable. The lesson Iran can take from recent history is that no matter what Iran does, Israel is trying to dismember it, subjugate it, and use the United States to do that.
Colonel, is Israel on the path of achieving what he was promised to achieve, what he was set to achieve?
Neiman, let me back it up a little bit and say that while I agree on a tactical level with what Trita and the ambassador said, I don't agree on a geostrategic level. I don't think Bibi Netanyahu convinced Trump of anything. I think some of the advisors that Trump listens very closely to convinced him of what I've been saying all along about the movement of power. Back to the east, that's where power is going. Every element of state power is going back to the east. We have got an arc of crisis now established. I just was on a webinar with DOD about the Arctic, and I was stunned at the language I heard with regard to Russia and the Arctic. We're going to go to war with Russia in the Arctic very shortly. all the way from the Arctic down to where that little pipsqueak country on the northern flank of NATO, I think it's called Norway, is actually challenging Russian shipping, which by the law of the sea treaty is in international waters, but it's in their economic zone. The treaty's clear about that, where freedom of passage takes place, even to the point where they put some divers in the water and were going to put mines on the ship until the Russians flew a couple of fighters over and ferried them out and scared them away, down to the war in Ukraine, which is still going, and on to the Levant and down to this current development in Southwest Asia with Iran. This is all to arrest China's ability to put its base road initiative into effect south, central, and north. And this is part of it. And you have to have regime change in Iran, or at least a very perceptible change in their direction of affiliation. BRICS can't be in it, for example, in order to do that. And we've got a group that's advising Trump in the background, and it consists of about 100 billionaires, most of whom we would call technocrats, or whatever term we want to give them. Think Elon Musk for a moment, but he's not really a principal, I'm told. A third of them are Jewish Americans or hold dual citizenship. But I think this confab, this group, is advising Trump, and they are convincing him that not only is China our number one enemy, that the only way we're going to arrest the relationship that's developing between China and Russia and the development of BRICS and all that that means is to counter them all along that arc. And this is the latest development of it at its southern extremity, if you will.
Trita, I think you would be in a position to explain to us with the case of the regime change, so-called regime change that Colonel Wilkerson has mentioned. They were people in the Trump administration together with the Netanyahu administration. They believe that with this attack they can do regime change in Iran, so-called regime change. What can we say? What is your information on what's going on in Iran in the aftermath of the attack, Israeli attack on Iran?
There is neither any sign of uprising in Iran or uprising in Israel, because you also have to keep in mind that there were elements in Iran who thought that the bombardment so far of Israel would have led to a massive outpouring of opposition to the war. That has not happened. And I don't foresee that happening until the Israelis conclude that they have exhausted all of their opportunities to drag the US into the war. As long as the Israelis continue to believe that the US can be dragged into the war, they will take the hits, but they will not stop the war. They've not fought this far to get the US into this war and then giving up now. On the Iranian side, we're seeing quite the opposite, a tremendous rallying around the flag phenomenon beyond what I expected, given the unpopularity of the regime. And you're also seeing simultaneously a massive discrediting of voices on the outside in the diaspora who for quite some time have been aligning themselves with Israel, defending Israel's genocide in Gaza, and asked for Israel to intervene, and are continuing to do so right now. I just saw a couple of things on social media in which one of these voices were saying that, are you really sure you want to stop the bombing when you think of the girls that they poisoned, referencing to incidents after the demonstrations against Masa Amini, in which there were accusations that there were gas being slipped through schools, etc., to harm girls. And people are saying things like that are just getting massacred on social media by ordinary Iranians who are opposed to the regime, but never wanted to see their country bombed in this indiscriminate way, in this illegal war of aggression that is happening. People like Reza Pahlavi and others who have acted as spokespeople of the Israeli Defense Forces, similar to other Israeli Defense Force spokespeople on Western media who go out there to explain that there was this or that tunnel under that refugee camp, there was this or that tunnel under that hospital that Israel bombed, or that we didn't intend to bomb that hospital or that university or that school or that kindergarten. And these tiring lies that have been spread for a year and a half Now they have a new spokesperson in Reza Pahlavi who's going out there saying that the Israelis are not targeting civilians, that Israelis are doing everything they can to be careful, the same playbook. And whatever little credibility he had, which was primarily rooted in his name recognition, and secondly, in the unpopularity of the regime itself, whatever little he had has been completely destroyed. Because you have to remember, a lot of other people who, out of nostalgia or other reasons, have been attached or attracted to it, have to a large extent done so because they view the regime of the Shah having been a nationalist government. And now when they're seeing that his son is actually cheering on a foreign war of aggression, it goes against everything that nationalism stands for. And he's really destroyed not only his own name, but much of the legacy of his monarchy.
Yeah. Ambassador, when it comes to the regime change, how did Netanyahu somehow manage to convince Donald Trump to let him to go to Iran, to fight Iran, to attack Iran? It was about the regime change. It was about the nuclear facilities. They convinced him that they can hit the nuclear facilities. Your take on that?
I agree with Larry. This isn't Netanyahu. This is Netanyahu's Legion, fifth column in the United States. He called them technocrats. I call them nincompoops. But anyway, whatever they are guilty of hallucinatory fantasies. Trita, I think you're absolutely right. The son of the Shah is a pathetic figure. He was even before this. This has made him the enemy of the Iranian people in a way that he wasn't. But I would disagree with you. I think in both cases, in Israel and in Iran, the governments have a credibility problem. Pezeshkian has a serious credibility problem, as does Khamenei. In Israel, the Netanyahu government had a credibility problem even before this started. Both governments are hiding battle damage with varying degrees of success. It looks to me as though the slow roll the Iranians put on to exhaust Israeli ballistic missile and air defenses has really done that to a great extent. Israelis are running out of appropriate interceptors. The United States doesn't have the capacity to fully replenish what Israel has lost, although there have been, I think, 14 shipments of weapons to Israel since this war began. And I think what people are beginning to see is that contrary to what Ursula von der Leyen said, which is idiotic, that the source of instability in the region is Iran. The source of instability in the region is Israel, and the causes of that are twofold. First, Israel has such a high degree of Western backing that it can act with impunity, absolute impunity. So the keys are Western backing, which is crumbling under the impact of Israeli evil behavior, and second, Israel's sense that it has impunity. I don't know where this war is going to end, but I don't think it's going to end in either the partition of Iran or an uprising in Israel, but both sides will be seriously weakened. And I don't know what the United States is going to do, but I hope to God we have the good sense to stay out of this war. That Mr. Trump, by marshaling so many air tankers and other 2 aircraft carriers and so forth in the direction of the Persian Gulf, is once again doing what he did by deploying Diego Garcia. That is, making a show of force to back a negotiation. And there is a solution here, I think, if we can ever get to it, which is the proposal for regional enrichment, some shared enrichment regime that brings in Iran's adversaries or checks on its enrichment to a joint effort. And I understand Araqchi actually has been amenable to that. But there won't be any negotiation, I don't believe, until the war winds down.
From what I understand, as we see the officials in Iran talking about, they want to enrich uranium on Iranian soil. I don't see that they're
Right.
going to give up on that. Carl, your take on that?
Well, I agree with the ambassador there that there's a possibility there, and I don't think that's an impediment, Nima, because I think we would agree to the 3.67% or whatever it is that they could enrich on their own soil. What I'd like to see accompany that is something that we were working on in Pacific Command, believe it or not, in 1984 and 1985, and that's a nuclear weapon-free zone.
Right.
We were actually pushing that out there for different reasons than you might suspect, but we were. Attach that with this sort of consortium, and you could have a much better situation in that region. You'd have no nuclear weapons. Israel, of course, have to give up its weapons. And we know how to destroy nuclear warheads. We did about 20,000 of them at the end of the Cold War. That would be a good solution. But back to the present, the whole time, and Ambassador's absolutely right about what Israel's doing to itself. The whole time this has been going on, they've been slaughtering Gazans in incredible numbers.
Exactly.
4, 79, 59. And they're killing them mostly at these humanitarian aid points, which I'm beginning to suspect is their ploy. They're doing the aid where they're doing it and consolidating the people so they can kill them more efficiently. And in the West Bank, they're not doing much better. So Israel is really hoisting itself on its own petard, and the fuse is lit. 2 fuses, 3 fuses are lit. And that's something it's difficult to calculate what that'll mean. Are they going to be bound and determined to even commit suicide if necessary to get regime change in Iran when Trump backs out, as it were, of any promise to do anything other than perhaps resume negotiations, given that the Iranians might be willing after they've done some real more pummeling of Israel. And they are pummeling them. I got some video clips from inside Israel this morning. Holy mackerel. They are doing significant damage. And you've got Israelis lined up at psychiatric wards. They've not seen this. And I told a group this morning, I said, you wait until we have to experience this, because we'll be the same way. We haven't experienced this ever in our generational lifetime. Have we experienced this kind of bombardment? Go to war, United States, go to a real war and see what you get out of it. You will be in trouble, significant trouble. It ain't Iraq. It isn't Afghanistan. You're talking about a very large conflict if you get involved significantly in Southwest Asia. One that will probably be, this sounds dire and everything, but I believe it will be the end of the empire. It'll be the unraveling of the empire. The physical debt we will accumulate alone. The fact that we find out we can't conscript our youth. They'll go to Mexico and Canada. And we can't field armies. We simply can't. And the only way you're going to round out the nuclear program and get rid of it to a 95% certitude, and I say only 95% because software's up here, not in the ground, is to mount the peninsula, as it were, the landmass, and attack with ground troops. And anybody, that's as stupid as a land war in Asia, as the Princess Bride pointed out. But we might do. There are some people in the Pentagon who would lust for that. Thank God there are a lot more who wouldn't.
Trita, when it comes to the regional enrichment, as Ambassador Freeman and Colonel mentioned, a consortium or a regional, somehow a coalition, some sort of an organization being responsible for that. Your take on how the Iranian feel about it?
So the Iranians themselves have actually proposed this in the past. And in the proposal that the Iranians were supposed to give on Sunday before the Israelis blew up the negotiating table, it entailed an element of that. Their red line on that is similar to the red line they have in general. They're open to a consortium. They want it to be with regional states as well as others, but it has to have the enrichment component on Iranian soil. So that they've already been open to, and they could agree to it again. Again, the critical thing here is whether Trump insists on zero enrichment or is open to 3.67. That's going to be the critical element here.
Yeah,
so I think we shouldn't forget that the Lesser Tums islands in the eyes of Iran are part of Iran. And in the eyes of the UAE, they're part of the UAE. So there is a compromise even on this issue of doing things on Iranian soil if people are sufficiently imaginative. After all, Iran started out with enrichment in France until the United States killed that. So obviously Iran would very much prefer to have the enrichment in Isfahan or someplace. But I think in the end...
And they've expressed also openness that the enrichment would be in new facilities, not in existing ones. And given the bombing, perhaps that would be a necessity anyway. Could I add one thing to what Chaz and Larry have been saying?
Go ahead.
And they will probably be able to add more military detail to it. I just want to say that, we are in one of those moments, they're far too frequent, unfortunately, in which we're seeing a massive amount of manufactured consent taking place in mainstream media. If you listen to mainstream media, you would think that Israel has completely won this war and all the US needs to do is just step in with one small flyover, as they said on Fox News, and everything is finished. Every time there's a lull in Iranian missile attacks, for instance, on Tel Aviv in a retaliation for what the Israelis started, you start hearing that, the Iranians can no longer do so, they're losing, it's collapsing. And there's several explanations as to why there's been an up and down in the number of missiles that they've sent. One is that the Israelis have been successful to a certain extent to take out the launchers. But it's also because the Iranians are testing new missiles. It's also because they're testing Israel's air defenses and degrading those carefully in the long term instead of just rushing. It's also because they're saving some missiles because they expect this to be a long term fight rather than a short one. Now, I'm sure there's 10, 15 others that Larry probably could tell me that is also part of the mix. The only one you're hearing on mainstream media, however, is that the Israelis have taken out the launchers. And then suddenly you have a huge barrage of attacks, very successful. Immediately we see the media play the victim card. I'm not saying that the Iranians are winning this war. I'm not saying that they have not suffered tremendously. They certainly have. I'm not saying that Israel is not profoundly technologically superior to Iran, mindful of the American weaponry that it has. But I think we have to recognize that this manufactured consent, in order to make this look as if the Israelis are winning and that we're very close to an end, serves two key functions. To make sure that the public here thinks that the Iranians are on the verge of capitulation, and as a result, diplomacy is not necessary. Why would you engage in diplomacy if you can just get them to capitulate and surrender? And secondly, to lower the resistance in the administration for getting engaged militarily, because the more this looks like a real success that is about to be finished, all you need to do is do that one flyover, and you can take credit for this victory, the more tempted the administration is going to be, at least Trump, to do so. Reality is very, very different. And we've seen that in every war, that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation, disinformation, and flat out propaganda and lies. And it comes from all different directions. But I hope the American public is as resistant to it as possible, because this is designed to bring the American people and America into this war. Similar to what we saw, how the lies about how well the Iraq war was going served the purpose of delaying the natural resistance that would come from the political establishment and from the public to that war as long as it could, because the media kept on spreading misinformation about how splendidly that war was going.
Yeah. Nima, I'll offer a proof of that. It's a tactical proof, if you will, but I've been reading Haaretz for years now, and particularly closely in the last 13, 14 months, even longer. They've changed their tune. They've changed their tune. They're far more sympathetic to Israel now than they were before. There's still a little balance there, but they are succumbing to the propaganda that's going out in Israel. And the propaganda now in Israel is so tightly controlled by Netanyahu because he's got the borders closed. He's got no one's traveling unless you got enough money to rent a yacht and sail across the Mediterranean, which I understand a lot of rich Israelis are doing. But when Haaretz turns its tone into one that is fundamentally supportive of what's going on in Israel, and lamenting the crisis that's occurring because of the rockets coming in and such. I know things are really different in terms of any opposition whatsoever inside of Israel, and they're lying. They're just flat lying. The Iranians they're pummeling Israel in the sense that Israel has never had this happen to them before. And I suspect, knowing what their stores probably are that are still underground and the very methodical way they're using those stores presently, and the strategy they're exercising to try and get Israel to burn out, which they're doing rapidly. And by the way, we don't have anything much to replace them with now, which the Pentagon's colonels are telling the generals, if you're worried about any threat in the world, you are running out. We've even got defense contractors fanning out across the country. Arkansas, Arizona, Michigan, trying to find production lines that they can convert into missile production lines and other instruments like that. And they're not finding many takers either because they don't want to produce these things. So it's not what it looks like from the propaganda, and the propaganda is all Americans listen to. The polls right now, though, are effectively against us entering this war. Across the board, political party notwithstanding, it's about 60%. Republicans are even higher because they're fed up with this guy who said he wasn't going to go to war and seems to be manufacturing them as a matter of course. But that could change dramatically were Iran to expand the war and start hitting U.S. facilities and such. I hope they're smart enough not to do that, because right now the pendulum is swinging, and I think the pendulum is slowing, and it's going to slow in Iran's favor, not Israel's favor. Coming back to the original proposition I presented, though, will that be enough to stop the United States from trying to effect regime change anyway?
Just to buttress, I know Trita has to leave us pretty soon, so just a couple of quick points. First, you can tell Israel's in trouble when Ben-Gvir, the Minister of Security, says that it should be a crime for anybody to listen to Al Jazeera.
Yeah.
That is a sign that there's a real problem that's being covered up. Second, about 2 hours ago, I understand, Iran fired the Khorramshahr 4 at Israel. This is an IRBM, an intermediate range ballistic missile that is maneuverable in its last stage and has some 80 bomblets on it that disperse. It's probably not interceptable by anything that either Israel or the United States have. It is something that the Arrow or the THAAD would go after, but we're running out of arrows and THAADs. So that's the second point. And the third is, just to go back to something Larry said, which is very important. Israel's organized these feeding stations like stockyards, leading people to the slaughter. They are literally behind metal partitions lined up so they can be shot. And we're seeing horrendous numbers of people being murdered. And finally, Larry, just to go to the point about retooling factories and reinventing everything, as you know, I follow matters Chinese a bit. And what I'm hearing is there is going to be an incredible exodus of scientists, engineers from this country this summer, headed largely for China, because they don't want to work in Trump's America under the circumstances that we're producing. So we are not doing the right things in this struggle on any level that I can see. And the idea that somehow or other you can force a capitulation on Iran from the air, anybody who remembers the Vietnam War ought to think about how likely that proposition is to succeed.
Yeah. I would just
go ahead.
Just add to that. I got visual proof of this morning. 855 and 815A, two of the most sophisticated electronics ships in the world. Think USS Liberty in 1967 in the eastern end of the Mediterranean, just pulled into the Persian Gulf.
Right. from China.
Yeah. So, and I also heard this morning from Larry Johnson, I think it was, that Putin has essentially said, okay, I understand you didn't want to sign the agreement, Iran. You didn't want to sign it to the point that we would come to your defense were you to be attacked. That's fine. But I'm sending you S-400s now. And they will be arriving very shortly. I don't know what this means, but I do know it means that Russia and China understand what the United States' ultimate objective is. And they're not happy with it. And I don't blame them.
Yeah, Trita, what ambassador said earlier said that the government in Iran, Pezeshkian government in Iran, is not in a good position right now because, as Putin yesterday mentioned, they offered Iran to provide them with weapons. Iran refused to receive Russian weapons. And how do you find the Iranian government right now? Because they somehow try to approach to the United States, right, to negotiate with the United States, and they end up being attacked by Israel.
So I'm not entirely sure about the accuracy of all of that reporting. I've seen other reporting also that after the arms embargo was lifted at the UN in 2022, they had the option of buying some Chinese systems that are integrated, which is the ones that the Pakistanis bought and used just a couple of weeks ago to some significant degree of success, apparently. And the Iranians opted not to go in that direction. I don't know what the answer is. I do speculate, however, that a degree of reluctance of bringing in the Russians in early can be motivated by two factors potentially. One is a fear that it would further escalate matters at a point in which they thought perhaps the escalation was still possible. And secondly, a fear that if you end up bringing in the Russians, potentially Chinese, assuming that that's even possible, and I'm not so sure it is, particularly with the Chinese, you don't want to create a situation in which the Russians, who the Iranians don't trust, would try to take advantage of the situation and use Iran to bleed America in the same manner that the United States has used Ukraine to bleed Russia. And in that sense, lose a degree of control as to when they can end the war and not allow that decision to fall too far outside of the hands of Iran itself by ending up in a scenario in which we become too dependent on the Russians, and the Russians may have an interest in continuing the war, even though the Iranians may not want to. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I'm not saying that's what the Russians are planning. I'm just saying that I can see that that could be one of the motivations behind the Iranians, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's been proven to be counterproductive or not. I'm not commenting on. I'm just saying that those are potentially some of the calculations and thinking behind these decisions.
Plus, if we drive the price of oil up, Russia makes a lot of money.
Yeah. My apologies. I do have to leave, but thank you so much to include me once again. Always great to see you, Chaz and Larry, and of course, Nima, you as well.
Thank you, Trita. See you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
So I want to add just go back to Larry's point that Iran is successfully pummeling Israel. And this is the first time that Israel's really had to take any of its own medicine. It's used to doing this to others, not having it done to itself. In recent times, it has, in northern Israel, experienced very effective pummeling from Hezbollah for a while, but nothing like what's going on now. And so I'm not at all convinced that if Iran were now open to and asked for air defense from, let's say, China, that the Chinese would not supply that for several reasons. I think when we look at things, we tend to think in military strategic terms, and the Chinese are non-interventionists. That's clear. They don't want to get involved in this war directly. But they might very well be willing to make some arms sales because defending Iran, which has a right to defend itself, of course, Israel keeps claiming it's defending itself, but Iran really is, since this was unprovoked. Selling weapons to a country to enable to defend itself is entirely consistent with the principles of international relations that the Chinese and the Russians are attempting to advance through the BRICS group and others. So I'm not at all sure that, I had been thinking, yeah, after the war is over, there will be a rebuilding of Iranian air defenses by Russia, by China, by whoever. I'm not sure that it has to wait for the end of the war, frankly.
Another aspect, Nima, of that, I was thinking of the 36 and years around that when Hitler really tested the Wehrmacht tactics and machinery and weapon systems, airplanes in Spain.
Yep.
What a place for China to test some of its weapons, give them to Iran and let them use them against Israel or whatever. These are the kinds of ingredients of more regional or even global wars that develop. We'd be reading about them in history books. I hope we'd be reading about them 20 years down the road. How did this happen? How did that happen? How did we walk in the march of folly towards a bigger and worse war? And you begin to pick all these things out. Were I the Chinese military, I would want to do that. I would want to put some of my more sophisticated equipment, maybe not the most sophisticated, because then you tell your enemies what it'll do, but put it out there and see how it performs. That's what we're doing. We do it all the time.
Let me go ahead.
As was mentioned in Pakistan, basically, those were not top-of-the-line Chinese weapons. They were export models. They performed very well. The Chinese have spent a lot of time studying what went right and what went wrong with those weapons. I think Larry's right. Iran would offer another test base for them to look at. But I think we also need to worry if indeed the United States does conduct that flyover that Trita mentioned, whether it intimidates the Iranians or not. I think the United States engages directly. We've been put on notice by the Iranian government that they will strike our bases in the region. And indeed, there's a precedent for that. Iran did a basically symbolic small-scale attack on Ain al-Assad base in Iraq after the murder of Soleimani to protest that. So it isn't as though there isn't a precedent. And we've got a lot of people out there on ships and on air bases. I know that the Iranians have told Qatar that it will not be exempt from an attack on Al-Udeid, the Qatari air base that we use as our central operating component in the region. So I think we're talking about something very close to igniting a broad regional conflict, and possibly, as Larry's analogy to Spain illustrates, extending the proxy war theaters to West Asia in a way that they haven't been up to now.
And just to follow up on the ambassador's comments about the troops out there, by and large, they are undefended. They are not the kind of people who go into combat, except, the pilots who fly the airplanes and so forth. But the bases themselves are undefended. Bahrain, the naval headquarters there, is defended by the Bahraini Defense Force. It would be a slaughter. And the sad thing about that, too, is if that happened, if the Iranians made that move, then the Poles in the United States, which now support no war, would flip over.
Yep. Yeah. By the way, the latest poll I saw showed that only 16% of Americans favor our entering this war.
Right.
There are various degrees of opposition, but the support just isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel, today Putin said that Russia and Iran are fighting against the same forces. And here we know that there was a call between the Russian president and Xi Jinping, the leader of China. And nobody knows what has happened, but they were talking about the case of the conflict in the Middle East, the situation between Israel and Iran. Here is what the Chinese political commentator Victor Gauss said about if the United States participates, attacks Iran?
Back against aggressors, and if the United States wants to join Israel to become an aggressor against Iran, well, history will eventually have its own verdict. If other countries want to join the fight on the side of Israel, I will urge them to stop that right away. And if, for example, other countries want to join the fight against Iran, you never want to exclude the possibility that other major countries want to fight together with Iran, because the war imposed on Iran is the unjustified war. It's a war of aggression. It's undeclared war. It's a surprise attack. And any people, any country under such surprise attack, an attack of aggression, has full legal justification to fight back.
Colonel.
That's always been a very solid Chinese position. You know, you can point to this or that problem with the Chinese fulfillment of that position, but it's been a very strenuously supported position by the Chinese government for a long time. It's just don't cross other countries' borders and attack them aggressively. And they get out of the Taiwan issue by Taiwan's a part of China. They're not crossing the border.
And they've fudged the Ukraine issue a bit.
Yeah.
They have not recognized the annexation of Crimea or the 4 eastern oblasts.
Nor Kosovo, I don't think.
No, that's right. They have not recognized Kosovo either, for the same reasons of principle. But on the other hand, they have not condemned Russia, whereas they have condemned Israel.
Yeah.
The foreign minister, Wang Yi, was quite definite about that.
Well, they got 9.4% of their oil from Russia last year. So
yeah, well, not just that, you know, I mean, they have a 4,000-mile border with Russia.
Again, Geopolitics.
Yeah. So they're realistic. But when Xi Jinping talked to Vladimir Putin, he was a little more guarded, but he did say that people in the war had to wake up and rediscover reason, especially Israel, he said. So it's very clear on which side the Chinese are in this struggle.
And I think the Chinese see this regime change in Tehran for exactly what it is, what I said before. This is another attempt to arrest their movement into the world, which is, in their eyes, and I think in my eyes too, the more I think about it, and I do all the time, is not an aggressive move in the sense that we think it is. But we can't take any challenge to our hegemony. And that's going to be ultimately our downfall.
The case of the Chinese, of course, they had experience of almost 30 years of U.S. efforts at regime change in Beijing. So they're not sympathetic to that at all.
Which even Smedley Butler knows something about.
Well, he was right about lots of things.
Ambassador, you mentioned that, it was you mentioned that if the price of oil goes up, it would benefit Russia. But it's not just about if the price of oil. We know that wouldn't benefit China. China would be, they're not interested in that. At the same time, you see a lot of things happening. You know, you see if something happens in the Middle East, with the case of Ukraine, China sees the situation, the scene, that the United States is somehow involved with Iran and with Russia, and they're going to sit back, say, so that's amazing. They're not going to come to us anytime soon, as they're involved with Russia and Iran. But we know how strategic Iran is for Russia and somehow for China. Russia is not, I don't believe that Russia wants to lose Iran in the case of the radicalism, the religious radicalism in the region. They're so afraid of what's going on in Chechnya, in Dagestan. That's why they need a government in Iran to manage that. Your take on these sort of 3D and geopolitical issues happening there?
Well, several comments. First, oil prices have been very low, in part because the Saudis want to kill the fracking industry in the United States. And if they go up, fracking will again become profitable, and there will be lending to the frackers who are on about an 18-month cycle versus the 11 or 15-year cycle for conventional oil supplies. China's been taking advantage of the low prices to fill up their strategic petroleum reserve very thoroughly in anticipation of a possible conflict with the United States. Presumably that would halt if the prices went up. Speaking of the strategic importance of Iran, Iran has always been a strategically central country. It is the passageway from India to Russia, to Eastern Europe. It is the passageway from China to Europe. It's at the center of many, many things. It's also geographically a very tough nut to crack, very mountainous in much of the terrain, a long history of holding off foreign adversaries, whether they were nomads from the steppe who came south, or whether they were the Romans whom they held off for about 5 centuries. So Iran is both a very defensible and strategically quite central crossroads in global trade and historically, and it still is. And we're now seeing the importance of Iran actually accentuated as the Chinese now build a railway from Kashgar in Xinjiang over the Karakoram through Bishkek and Tashkent in Uzbekistan, connecting to Iran. And we also see, that's exactly right, that is now under construction. And we also see the south-north corridor being built from Chabahar to St. Petersburg, the Baltic, going the other way. So these historical trade routes are being modernized and their importance increased. So from a geopolitical point of view, there's a great deal at stake in Iran.
Colonel,
Big country that's never had really good relations with Russia.
Well, putting it mildly, they lost a lot of territory to the Russians.
Colonel, here is, let me play a clip of Sean Hannity with Senator Tom Cotton. He's talking about the situation in the Middle East, and the way he's picturing the situation is somehow beyond me. I cannot understand. Let me play it for you.
Give up their long-range missiles and, frankly, any missile that has a range to hit any American target in the region. I think that would be a fair deal, considering they have no leverage and their backs against the wall because the Israelis have kicked their ass.
Yeah. It seems that they're talking about the Iranian missiles. It's not just about the Iranian nuclear program. It's something.
Yeah. Well, it's always been a part of our gripe, always. We insisted initially in the JCPOA about including them and including other things too. And the Iranians held fast, and we realized it wasn't negotiable. So we narrowed our view a little bit. But we've always been concerned about the ballistic missiles. In my administration with George W. Bush, when we were more or less taking down the AQ-CON network, or as best we could, Iran, let me back up a minute. If you want to talk about the axis of evil, my working group put North Korea, Iran in that axis of evil. And Iraq was in there too, but the two potent powers in there were Iran and North Korea. And we watched the North Koreans come to Iran and teach them how to go underground, deeply underground, and how to do things that they were doing in North Korea. When they exploded their first nuclear weapon, we didn't even know they exploded it. We didn't even know they exploded it. The seismic center in Geneva, I think it is, gave us a warning that there had been some seismic activity. We put our sniffers in the air. We put everything else out there, you know. We couldn't detect the test. The second one we detected because we had some idea from the first one, their seismic report, where it might take place. And indeed, they use the same place again. So it's not that easy is all the point I'm trying to make. But the other point is that we've always been interested in this. And the Iranians, rightfully so, wanting to defend themselves from regional powers in a very dangerous region, and not just Israel, but Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the other countries, Emirates, other countries too, who mostly have airplanes and missiles as their ability to attack, if you will. Iran's possession of missiles was clearly understandable, just because of the dangerous place where it lived. Now, the Obama administration ultimately bought that, I think, and that's the reason they limited it to the things that they really were concerned about, the nuclear program. But I think everyone in the process knew that anytime you talked about missiles and other instruments of conventional war, if you will, the Iranians were not going to bend an inch. And trying to disarm them was absolutely absurd, stupid. They live in a dangerous world.
A couple of comments about the cartoonish geopolitical discussions on Fox News. The thesis that Iran has no leverage is exactly the same argument that we heard about the Russians in Ukraine.
Yep.
You know, they've run out of weapons, they have no leverage, they're falling apart, their economy's going down, you know, they're going to give up. Sure. And how many times did MI6 plant stories about the Russians running out of missiles? You know, we're hearing the same tired arguments we heard for the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, and deposing Saddam Hussein. We're hearing the same tired arguments we heard with regard to the Russian-Ukrainian war. But with regard to missiles, Larry, there's a point here that really needs to be remembered, and that is that there was the War of the Cities between Iran and Iraq, which went on for 8 years. And, buildings started blowing up in both places, and nobody knew, how that was being accomplished because they didn't understand the exchange of missiles in the beginning. And I don't know how many, maybe 2 million people died in that war.
Yeah.
It's a reason that Iran doesn't want to have a war. It's also a reason that Iran is very sensitive to the need to have its own ability to defend itself with missiles against other people with missiles. So this business of, I go back to the thesis that the Israeli agenda here is disarm Iran, subjugate Iran, break it up into its parts, eliminate it as a threat militarily to what? To Israeli regional supremacy.
Yes.
Because Iran doesn't, Iran may care about the Palestinian issue or may simply be using it for geopolitical advantage. It really doesn't matter. It's not prepared to go to war over the Palestinian issue. And so Israel faces no threat from Iran with regard to its principal Achilles heel, its great weakness, which is its unwillingness to coexist with anyone else in historic Palestine.
Nima Hannity reminds me of Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz going before the Congress not once but twice, first time to tell him that Ken Shinseki was wrong, that he didn't see anything near 500,000 necessary troops for Iraq, more like about 50,000. And that when he was asked how much it would cost, he said, well, we think the Iraqi oil will pay for the whole thing. Cost us over $1 trillion. And you know the rest of the story.
Not finished yet.
Ambassador, the British media, something strange, somehow surprising came out from the British media. They're talking about if Donald Trump decides to attack Iran, to bomb Iran, he's going to use, because these bunker buster bombs, they're not going to be effective in destroying nuclear facilities. They're going to use tactical nuclear weapons against Iran. And is that something made up in the British intelligence in the United Kingdom, or there is something going on with the Trump administration in that sense?
Well, it reflects discussions in the Pentagon, which have been very realistic. The bunker busters are not mountain busters. And the only way you can really be sure of destroying Fordo is with a nuclear weapon. We have to hope and imagine that there are people who are sensible enough not to cross that red line. But I have to say, in an increasing number of arenas, we don't seem to have the appropriate nuclear allergy that we once did. And so this is not, and it is, I think, unrealistic of the British newspapers, which tend to be quite alarmist on many things, and to publish this kind of thing, but it's not without foundation.
And I'll say something else from a military point of view. Neither of these two bombs, which they're constantly confusing, that hang under a B-2, are capable of doing Fordo. They just aren't.
Right.
One of them that they constantly throw out there is a above ground explosion. Even that's the one we used with the Afghans. You may recall the monster bomb. I forget the designation, GHQB-15, GHQB-51, something like that. But the other one is the penetrator, and it penetrates before it explodes, and it's designed to go underground to take underground targets out. But it will not penetrate even half the distance that the Iranians have put this particular one underground. We talked about building one for North Korea at one time, and the cost was prohibitive, and the physics just didn't work either. So, and here I come to my point, a small yield nuclear weapon might not work either.
Mm-hmm.
We plan 10 MIRVed warheads on every Soviet silo because the silos are underground. And the only way we can guarantee that we're going to take out that missile in that silo, given fratricide and other problems, circular area of probability is not as small as we'd like it. We're working on that one so we can do a first strike, believe it or not. But we still have to put a lot of megatonnage on a silo in order to take out a missile. So there's no guarantee that even a 5 or maybe even a 20 KT nuke would do the job. What do you look like after you do that?
Donald Trump said that within 2 weeks he's going to decide about attacking Iran, and it doesn't mean that after 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, it can be tonight, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, Ambassador. But don't you, when you look at the Iranian foreign minister right now is in Europe talking with the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, how it's somehow unbelievable to me that Donald Trump, when came to power, came to his office, he said that he's going to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine. He came in with the ceasefire happening between Israel and Hamas. And right now, he lost his position in the talks between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know who's behind the scene running the show with the Zelensky administration. It's not Donald Trump. Go ahead.
Got to run. I got to know.
Okay.
I got to know.
Let me just very quickly answer that.
Yeah.
Then I've got guests arriving too. So I think the Europeans should not be talking to Iran. They should be talking to Israel. Israel started the war. Israel can stop the war. Iran has said it will halt its own bombardment of Israel if Israel stops attacking it. So what are the Germans and others doing talking to Araghchi? So they're putting pressure on Araghchi. This goes back to the stupid statement that von der Leyen made about Iran being the source of instability in the Middle East. So as for I'll decide in 2 weeks, you can read that 2 different ways. First, I haven't made a decision. Second, I think I have some leverage by being unpredictable, so I'm not going to predict anything. Third, maybe I will, maybe I won't. So maybe Iran will come to the negotiating table, despite saying that it won't do that while it's under attack. If I, scare Iran enough, maybe they'll come to the negotiating table. Again, going back to Alf Layla wa Layla, 1,001 Nights, the story, maybe the horse will learn to talk. That's possible. Maybe. Maybe the emperor will die. Maybe something will happen. In other words, he doesn't know what he's doing. And He's honest enough to tell us that. No one knows what I'm going to do.
No.
Of course, the implication isn't he doesn't have any idea what he's going to do. So I don't think this is an effective means of negotiating with a proud country like Iran. I'll leave it there.
Does he care about the people who voted for him, who supported him, who did everything for him to get elected? Tucker Carlson came out against him. We have even Tulsi Gabbard said, it seems that from the reports that we are hearing, Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth are not part of that situation room that he's doing recently in the case, for the case of Iran. What's going on within the administration that even Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard cannot be part of this discussion?
Well, this is something we're very familiar with, which is the battle between the Israel Firster and the American Firster factions inside the administration. Now, Mr. Trump is a strange man. He ran a reality TV show in which his most famous line was, "You're fired." But he turns out to be absolutely terrible at picking personnel. He picked a lot of people in his first administration who later turned on him and were very critical and wrote books which made fun of him. So he's got the same situation in his second administration. A lot of people he chose for their supposed loyalty and because they looked good on Fox News and no other qualifications. So I think the most dangerous thing about all this is the essential incompetence of this administration. There are people in it who don't know what they're doing. And of course, not just Tucker Carlson, but Steve Bannon, the evil genius of let's do in the administrative state, has come out and said this is completely wrong. Betrayal of what President Trump campaigned on. So I think on many levels, he risks losing his constituency. And we haven't even gotten to the point yet where inflation and the impact of tariffs will hurt the ordinary American family. It's just beginning to be detected. And we see polls that his immigration policies, which were once very strongly supported by a lot of the public, are now opposed by much of the public. So he's losing domestic support. And he has the same problem Netanyahu does and Pezeshkian does. How do you make decisions? How do you do things when your base of support is evaporating? This is a race against time. In a way, he said 2 weeks. Israel's going to run out of air defenses in 2 weeks. I don't think Iran's going to run out of things to throw at Israel in that period. We'll see. Anyway, I do have to. I'm very sorry, but I do have guests arriving.
Yeah.
At the front door.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Great pleasure as always.
And keep well and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Take care.